At 0614 on the morning of the 18th of December, 1942, Second Lieutenant John George pressed himself into the root system of a buttress tree on the western slope of Mount Austin and watched a Japanese soldier he could not shoot. The man was 310 yards away, partially concealed behind a log, and he was not alone. George could see the shape of at least two others in the undergrowth to the left, and somewhere ahead, invisible in the dense canopy, a machine gun had just killed Sergeant Raymond Kowalski. George had the Winchester against his shoulder. The trigger pull was 3.2 pounds. The crosshairs were steady, and he could not take the shot without giving away the position of the 23 men behind him. He waited. The Japanese soldier moved behind the log and disappeared. George lowered his rifle and began to think about geometry. He was 27 years old, Illinois state champion, and the Japanese had just fortified the mountain everyone said could not be held against a direct assault. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had been on Guadalcanal for 3 weeks. They had come to relieve the Marines. The Marines had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they had not taken Mount Austin, and they had not cleared the Gifu, the fortified ridge complex above the upper Matanikaw River, where the Japanese had built 47 bunkers into the hillside and connected them with communication trenches deep enough to stand in. 500 Japanese soldiers of the 124th and 228th Infantry Regiments occupied that position. The Americans had been trying to crack it since the 17th of December. They had not cracked it. The terrain made conventional assault tactics almost useless. The jungle reduced visibility to under 10 feet in most directions. Artillery could not be accurately directed at targets no observer could see. Mortars were partially effective, but the canopy diffused blast and shrapnel before it reached the bunker roofs. The bunkers themselves were constructed with logs, 2 feet thick covered by 2 feet of packed earth, and the firing apertures were cut low to the ground and angled to provide overlapping fields of fire. You could not rush one without exposing yourself to 3 others. George S. Commanding Officer, Captain Ellsworth Morris, had explained all of this at the briefing on the 17th of December. The regiment was going in. They were going to take Mount Austin and clear the Gifu. Morris had looked at George S. Winchester Model 70 sitting against the tent pole and told him to leave it with the supply sergeant. This was not a shooting competition. This was a bunker fight and a bolt. Action sporting rifle with 5 rounds was not a bunker fighting weapon. George said he understood. He took the Winchester anyway. The other platoon leaders noticed. Lieutenant Harris from B Company asked him if he planned to hunt deer between assaults. Lieutenant Carew said the rifle was nice for sport but suggested George carry something semi-automatic if he expected to live through the first morning. The battalion armorer, a corporal from Chicago named Dempsey who had been maintaining weapons since 1937, looked at the Lyman Alaskan scope and asked if the glass was good enough to see a Japanese soldier through 2 feet of log. George explained that the scope was for finding targets that other people could not find. Dempsey said that was a diplomatic answer. He handed George 200 rounds of .30 caliber and told him to try not to get shot with his own ammunition. Company B moved up the western slope of Mount Austin at 0445 on the 18th of December. The jungle was still dark. The men moved in single file on a trail that the Solomon Island scouts had found 2 days earlier. George was third in line behind the point man and the scout, a Solomon Islander named Marcus who had been working with the Americans since October and who moved through the night jungle without sound and without apparent effort. George had his Winchester slung across his back, muzzle down, with a bolt-action rifle. You did not carry it muzzle up in rain. The morning was already wet, the permanent tropical wet that soaked through clothing and equipment within minutes regardless of whether it was actually raining. The slope of Mount Austin was not steep in the way that cliff faces are steep. It was a continuous uphill through terrain designed by nature to exhaust and disorient. The buttress, rooted trees rose 80 and 90 feet straight up before branching, their enormous root flanges creating waist-high wooden walls that soldiers had to climb over or squeeze between. The undergrowth between the trunks was a tangle of ferns and thorned vines that caught at equipment and slowed movement to a crawl. On open ground, a soldier could cover a mile in 20 minutes. On this slope, a mile took 3 hours if nothing went wrong. At 0542, something went wrong. The point man dropped. He did not cry out. He was there and then he was not there. And then the jungle above them opened with rifle fire, and George heard the distinct mechanical chatter of a Type 96 light machine gun firing from somewhere in the canopy. The men went to ground immediately, pressing themselves into the root systems and behind tree trunks. George rolled left and came up behind a buttress root that was 14 inches thick at the base. The machine gun fire was passing overhead at about chest height, which meant the Japanese had expected the Americans to be standing, which meant they had heard the column coming, which meant this was not a random patrol contact, but a prepared ambush at a prepared position. George unslung the Winchester and got it to his shoulder. The Lyman Alaskan gave him 2.5 power magnification in low light, which was not much, but it was more than any Garand shooter had. He began scanning the canopy above the source of the machine gun fire. The Type 96 had a distinctive muzzle flash pattern at a high cyclic rate, and in the gray pre-dawn light he could trace the general direction of fire back toward a cluster of large banyan trees, approximately 120 yards upslope. He glassed the trees carefully, left to right, top to bottom. The gun was firing, but he could not locate the precise position. The canopy was too thick, and the light was too poor for the Lyman Alaskan to resolve the detail he needed. Kowalski had moved up to return fire with his M1 Garand when the second burst caught him. George saw him go down from 10 feet away. The sergeant had been in the process of bringing his rifle to bear on the muzzle flash when the machine gun walked across him. He went down sideways and did not move. George looked back at his men. They were pinned. The undergrowth to either side of the trail was too thick for immediate flanking movement. The Japanese had chosen the ambush site well. Upslope was the machine gun. The flanks were vegetation so dense it would take 10 minutes of cutting to move 20 feet. Going backward was retreat, and going backward on a single trail in contact was nearly as dangerous as going forward. George looked at the canopy again through his scope. The machine gun had paused. In the silence he could hear voices above, Japanese voices, the sound of equipment shifting. Someone was repositioning. He glassed systematically. He covered the near trees first, the ones within 80 yards, then worked outward. At 0558 he found what he was looking for. Not the gun itself, but the spotter. A Japanese soldier was positioned in the fork of a banyan tree, 95 yards upslope, and perhaps 40 feet off the ground, and he was looking down the slope with binoculars, directing fire. George could see the shape clearly now. The light was improving. The man was leaning forward slightly, both elbows braced on the branch ahead of him, the binoculars steady at his face. He was watching the Americans. He did not know George was watching him back. George controlled his breathing. The tree root was a stable platform if he positioned correctly, and he took 12 seconds to settle himself into the root fork with his left elbow solid on bark and his right side against the main trunk. The Winchester's trigger broke at 3.2 pounds, and he had adjusted it to that weight at Camp Perry before the war. He put the crosshairs on the center of the spotter, mass, and squeezed. The rifle cracked. The man in the tree fell forward off the branch and came down through the lower canopy and hit the jungle floor without making much noise, which surprised George because a man falling 40 feet from a tree should make more noise than that. The jungle absorbed him. The machine gun opened again immediately, which told George two things. First, the gun crew had seen his muzzle flash. Second, they had an alternate aiming point ready, which meant they had planned for the possibility that their spotter would be eliminated. The burst walked across the root system George had just been using, and he was already rolling right, moving away from the flash signature. He came up behind a different tree 12 feet to his right and pressed himself flat against the bark. He needed to find the gun. If you want to know how George found that machine gun position and what his Winchester did to it from 95 yards in near darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you have not already. Back to George, the Type 96 light machine gun was the Japanese answer to the Bren. It weighed 20 pounds and fired the 6.5mm Arisaka round at 550 rounds per minute from 30 round-curved magazines. It had a distinctive report, lighter in pitch than the American bar, and in the jungle the sound bounced between tree trunks in ways that made directional fixing difficult for untrained ears. George had trained ears. He had been listening to gunfire since he was 15 years old on the ranges at Fort Sheridan, and he had spent enough time studying Japanese weapons from captured examples and technical manuals to know the Type 96 signature. The gun was firing from ground level, which changed his search. He had been scanning canopy because the spotter had been in a tree. The gun was in a prepared position at the base of the slope, probably a fighting hole with a log overhead, the standard Japanese bunker configuration that the Americans had found in every position they had taken on this island. George moved again. Staying in any one position after firing was how you died. He moved right along the base of a large buttress root, crawling, keeping below the line of fire. The machine gun was still going in sustained bursts, sweeping the trail area methodically. In 30 seconds, George had moved 18 feet and was behind different cover. He raised his scope and began working the ground level, looking for the aperture, looking for muzzle flash, looking for anything that did not belong in the pattern of roots and undergrowth and soil. At 0604, he saw it. A log, an unnaturally straight log at an angle that did not match the fallen timber pattern of the surrounding jungle. 15 feet to the right of that log, he could see disturbed earth, fresh digging, the slight mound of excavated soil that soldiers always left when they dug in quickly. The fighting hole was there. The machine gun was firing from inside it. The aperture of a Japanese fighting position at ground level was typically 18 inches wide and 8 inches tall. At 95 yards in the light that was now just past gray and approaching usable, the Lyman Alaskan at 2.5 power gave him enough resolution to work with. He had one problem. The gun crew knew where he had fired from the first time. They would be watching for a second muzzle flash and they would be fast. George needed the gun to stop moving for 1 second. A burst ends and there is a pause while the crew feeds another magazine. That pause is between 1 and 3 seconds depending on training. George waited for the burst to end. He had the crosshairs on the aperture. The gun ran out of its magazine and went silent. George fired through the aperture. He worked the bolt immediately and fired again. He rolled hard right and kept rolling until he was behind a new tree trunk. The Type 96 did not fire again. George counted to 30. The jungle was quiet above him, except for the rifle fire from individual Japanese soldiers along the flanks of the position. He looked back and could see 2 of his men working to get Kowalski out of the line of fire. He looked up slope. With the machine gun gone, the nature of the problem had changed. The Japanese still held a prepared position above him. They had individual riflemen in the undergrowth and in firing holes and possibly in trees, but they no longer had the weapon that could suppress an entire column. George stood up partway and moved forward. He was not supposed to be doing this. A platoon leader was a command element. His job was to direct his men, not to function as a scout or a rifleman. Captain Morris would have significant things to say about this if George survived the morning. George was aware of this and moved upslope anyway, because the mathematics of the situation were simple. His platoon could not advance until the defensive position above them was disrupted. The only way to disrupt it was to find the individual firing positions and neutralize them. The men with Garands and bars could do that if they knew where to fire. The man with the scope could find where to fire. He worked upslope by moving from tree trunk to tree trunk, spending no more than 4 seconds in open ground between covers, moving at angles that made him difficult to track. Japanese riflemen were firing, but they were firing at the column behind him, at the area where the Americans had gone to ground. George was 30 yards ahead of where they expected anyone to be. At 0617, he reached the first prepared position, a circular fighting hole 4 feet deep with log overhead cover and a well-cut aperture facing downslope. The 2-man crew was dead. George had not expected that. He had fired twice through the aperture, but a Type 96 has a crew of 2, and he had expected at least one of them to be functional. Both men were down in the hole. He looked at the angle and realized the second round had done it, going through the aperture and deflecting off the far wall, and coming back at a downward angle. He took the Type 96. It was functional. It had a full 30-round magazine seated. George was not proficient on the Type 96, but he did not need proficiency. He needed noise and direction. He set the weapon on the rim of the fighting hole, aimed it upslope at the next visible prepared position, 40 yards ahead, and fired a full magazine in one burst. Then he picked up his Winchester and moved right. The Japanese on that slope had been prepared for an American frontal assault coming up the trail. They had not prepared for an American soldier in their own forward position, firing their own machine gun back at their rear positions. The burst caused confusion. George could hear it in the voices above him, the rapid back and forth of men trying to figure out what had just happened, where the fire had come from, why it had come from behind them. In that confusion, he moved. He covered 25 yards in the next 90 seconds, staying low using the terrain. At 0623, he came up behind a second prepared position and found it empty. The crew had heard the machine gun fire from their flank and moved. That was correct tactical behavior, and it was also the behavior that George had been hoping for, because a man who is moving to a new position is a man who is not covering his old aperture, and George was now inside the original perimeter of the defensive line. He was surrounded by Japanese soldiers. He was 50 yards ahead of his own platoon. He had the Winchester and 60 rounds and a Japanese Type 96 with no ammunition remaining. The situation was, by any standard assessment, poor George settled into the vacated fighting hole and began to work. The third prepared position was 35 yards to his left, and he could see the muzzle flash clearly now because he was above it rather than below it. A Japanese rifleman was firing downslope, steady aimed shots at the area where Company B had gone to ground. George watched through the Lyman Alaskan scope and placed the crosshairs on the shape above the aperture, the slight darkness at the top of the hole where a man's head would be as he aimed through the slit. He waited for the rifleman to commit to another shot, waited for the man to press forward against his own firing aperture in the act of sighting and squeezing. At 0629, the rifleman fired. George fired at the same moment. He could not confirm the hit because he was already rolling out of the fighting hole and moving left. The fourth position was 20 yards further left. This one had two men, and both were looking the wrong direction, looking to their right toward where George had just fired. He could see them from the rear, which was not a position the bunker construction had accounted for. He fired twice in 3 seconds. Both men went down. He kept moving. At 0641, George paused behind a large tree trunk and looked downslope. He could see shapes moving, his own men, Company B coming upslope in a rush, taking advantage of the disruption in the defensive line. Someone had made the call to advance. He did not know who. He did not know if Morris had seen what was happening, or if one of the other platoon leaders had simply looked at the situation and decided this was the moment to move. Either way, it was the right call. The defensive line was disrupted at its center and left. The Japanese on the right flank were still intact, but they were now facing men coming up the slope and a threat from their own position that they could not locate or explain. George moved further upslope to keep pressure on the disrupted positions. He found a fifth fighting hole at 0648 empty, abandoned within the last few minutes, judging by the still, warm brass on the ground. The crew had pulled back. That was information. A fighting position crew that pulls back is falling back to a secondary position, and secondary positions are usually prepared in advance, which means there was a line of bunkers higher on the slope that George had not yet seen. He went to ground and waited for the platoon to reach his position. Private Hayes was the first man to find George. Hayes was 21 years old, from downstate Illinois, and he had the expression of a man who had expected to die that morning and had not yet processed the fact that he had not. He looked at George and at the Winchester and at the 4 empty brass cases on the ground and did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked if the lieutenant had been up here the whole time. George said more or less. Hayes said the boys were going to hear about this. George told him to keep moving and to watch the right flank. Company B took the first line of prepared positions by 073. They counted 7 bunkers, each designed for a 2-man crew, with interlocking fields of fire. 5 of the crews were dead or had withdrawn. 2 bunkers had been abandoned intact with equipment still in place, which suggested the crews had left in a hurry, which suggested the disruption George had caused in the center of the line had been effective enough to make the flanks doubt their own position. It was not the kind of outcome you could reliably plan for. It was the kind of outcome that happened when the mathematics of a defensive position were disrupted before the defense had time to adapt. Captain Morris found George at 0745 and did not say anything about the Winchester or about platoon leaders functioning as scouts. He asked George what the next line looked like. George described the secondary positions he believed existed further upslope, explained his reasoning about the withdrawal direction of the bunker crews, gave a rough assessment of where the fighting holes would logically be placed given the terrain. Morris listened without expression and then told George to stay with the company. No more solo work. George agreed that was reasonable and meant it because the mathematics had changed. He had disrupted a prepared position and given his company a foothold on the first line, What came next would require more men and more weapons, and a bolt-action rifle with 2.5 power magnification was not what it required. What it required was what happened on the 23rd of December. The Gifu complex above them had now become the central problem of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. 500 Japanese soldiers in 47 bunkers, spread across the ridgeline, connected by tunnels and communication trenches, supplied through a logistical system that moved at night when American air observation was impossible. The 132nd Infantry had been battering at this position for 5 days and making no meaningful progress. Companies were taking casualties at a rate that threatened to render them non-functional. The terrain made flanking nearly impossible. The bunkers were too well constructed for the mortar support available to the regiment. The artillery that could destroy them could not be accurately directed, because no one could observe the fall of shot through the canopy. On the 22nd of December, Morris called George into the battalion command post, which was a collection of shelter halves stretched between trees on the reverse slope of a ridgeline 400 yards below the Gifu. 2 other officers were there, Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, and a major from regiment whose name George did not immediately recognize. The major had a map and a problem. The problem was machine gun position 8. Position 8 was a bunker on the northwestern corner of the Gifu complex that had been identified 3 days earlier when it killed 6 soldiers from a company in a single burst. Every assault on the western face of the Gifu had failed because of Position 8's overlapping field of fire. It covered 140 degrees of approach from the northwest, which was the only direction from which the terrain permitted a reasonably organized advance. Until Position 8 was silenced, the western assault could not proceed. Artillery had been tried twice. The jungle canopy had broken the shells before they reached the bunker roof. Mortars had been tried 4 times with no effect. A 3-man infiltration team had been sent in 2 nights ago to get close enough to use grenades. 2 of the 3 men had not come back. George asked how far the bunker was from the nearest covered approach position. The major said approximately 280 yards. George asked about the aperture orientation. The major said the aperture faced southwest, roughly 230 degrees magnetic, approximately 22 inches wide and 10 inches tall from the observations that had been made before the observers started dying. George asked about the roof construction. Fletcher said they believed it was the standard log and earth design, probably 18 to 24 inches of overhead cover minimum. George asked how tall the aperture's lower edge was from the ground. The major said the best estimate was 14 inches, but that was from a single observation. George picked up his Winchester from where it leaned against a tree trunk. He said he would need to see the approach position, and he would need 4 hours. Fletcher asked if George was proposing to shoot through the bunker aperture with a sporting rifle. George said he was proposing to try. Fletcher said the aperture was 22 inches wide at 280 yards and asked if George could hit a 22-inch target at that range with consistency. George said he had shot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights at Camp Perry in 1939. The aperture at 280 yards was not a small target by his standards. Fletcher looked at the Winchester and at George and then looked at Morris. Morris said he could confirm that George had performed work on the island that supported the claim. Fletcher said, all right, 4 hours, and if it worked, he wanted the approach position used for follow on fire until the aperture was no longer functional. George moved to the observation post at 0930 on the 23rd of December. The observation post was a shallow scrape behind a fallen tree on the forward slope, 280 yards from the bunker by the major's measurement and 283 yards by George's own pacing, which was close enough given that the first shot would tell him what he needed to know about the actual distance. The approach had taken 40 minutes of slow movement through vegetation that required cutting in 2 places, and George had spent both of those cutting moments feeling very exposed and very aware that somewhere ahead a machine gun covered this exact ground. He had brought Hayes with him as a spotter, and because Morris had told him not to go alone, Hayes had binoculars and a gerund and instructions to watch the flanks and not to fire unless fired upon. They settled in behind the fallen tree at 10:14. George glassed the bunker. It was well constructed. The Japanese had been on this mountain since at least October, and they had used the time to build the way a professional army builds when it knows it will be holding a position for a long time. The overhead cover was not 18 to 24 inches, it was more. George estimated 36 inches of log and packed earth above the firing aperture, which meant a direct hit from a 60mm mortar would dent the roof without penetrating it. The aperture itself was cut at a slight downward angle, which was tactically smart because it allowed the gun crew to depress the barrel into the approach zone without exposing themselves. The lower edge of the aperture was approximately 16 inches from the ground, close to the Major's estimate. At 280 yards, the Lyman Alaskan, at 2.5 power, resolved the aperture clearly enough for the work George intended. He settled into his position and began to study the angles. The Winchester Model 70 fired the .30 caliber cartridge, the same round as the M1 Garand, a 150 grain bullet at 2,900 feet per second muzzle velocity. At 280 yards, the bullet would drop approximately 8 inches from a 100-yard zero, which George knew from range work and confirmed with his scope adjustment. He had adjusted his zero that morning before moving to the observation post, shooting 3 rounds into a target at 200 yards and confirming his impacts, then calculating the additional drop for 280 yards. He had also adjusted for the wind, which was coming from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour based on the movement of the canopy and the feel of it on his face. At 280 yards, a crosswind of 8 miles per hour would push a .30 caliber bullet approximately 4 inches right of point of aim. He had made the adjustment. Hayes had his binoculars on the bunker and was watching the aperture. He said the gun had fired twice in the last hour, both times at movement to the south of the position, both times sustained bursts of 15 to 20 rounds. He said the crew was alert but not firing at random. They were watching for targets and engaging when they saw movement. George said that was useful to know. He asked Hayes to tell him when the gun fired its next burst. They waited. At 10:47, the Type 96 opened up. It was firing south, not at George and Hayes, at movement George could not see in the vegetation below. The burst lasted 14 seconds. George watched through his scope, not at the aperture, but at the ground in front of the bunker, watching for any soldier who might emerge to observe, any security position that might be watching the approach. He saw nothing. When the burst ended, he spoke quietly to Hayes. Hayes nodded. George put the crosshairs on the left edge of the aperture, 3 inches inside the opening. He was aiming at the left side of the interior darkness rather than the center because the gun was mounted to fire to the south, and the crew would be positioned to the right of the center line of the weapon, which meant the most likely human target was in the left half of the aperture interior. He was not certain of this. It was an inference from what he knew about Japanese bunker construction and crew positioning. But at 280 yards with a 2.5 power scope and a well-zeroed rifle in a stable position, he was not worried about hitting the aperture. He was trying to hit the man behind it. He fired. Hayes reported dust inside the aperture. Impact confirmed inside the bunker right side of the opening, approximately 4 inches from the left edge. Slight right on the wind call, George noted. He adjusted 2 clicks left. The machine gun had not responded. Either the crew was taking cover or someone was down. At 10:53, the Type 96 fired a single burst of 5 rounds, very short for this crew, and stopped. Hayes said the burst was aimed at George's position, not south, which meant they had a rough direction fix on the muzzle flash. George had expected this. He had chosen his position specifically because the fallen tree gave him cover to move right or left without exposing himself to the aperture. He moved 6 feet right and resettled. At 11:01, the Type 96 tried again. It swept the fallen tree position with a long burst that kicked debris off the top of the log and chewed the bark. George was 4 feet below the firing line, pressed into the slope, and none of it touched him. He waited for the burst to end. He came up in a different position, right of where he had been, with a different angle on the aperture. He fired once. He dropped back immediately without waiting for Hayes to call the impact. He moved left this time, back across his original position, and 6 feet further, a 16-foot lateral displacement. He resettled. He had 4 rounds left in the Winchester. The Type 96 did not fire for 11 minutes. At 11:12, George heard voices from the bunker. He could not understand the words, but the tone was urgent, the tone of men who are having a problem and discussing what to do about it. At 11:15, the gun fired one more time, a single short burst to the south, apparently to confirm it was still functional. It fired 3 rounds and stopped. Hayes said there was something different about the muzzle flash. It looked lower than before, like the gun was depressed below its normal aiming angle. George thought about that and decided it was consistent with a wounded crew compensating for an incapacitated gunner, possibly someone who had been hit in George's first shot and was now unable to maintain the gun at its designed elevation. He waited. Patience was the primary instrument of sniper work. At 11:24, a Japanese soldier appeared at the right side of the bunker aperture, head and shoulders visible, looking out at the approach zone. He was not at the gun. He was an observer, trying to identify the threat that had been shooting into their position. George was 280 yards away, and the soldier was framed in the aperture opening with the dark interior behind him, which gave George excellent contrast. He fired. The soldier disappeared from the aperture. George worked the bolt, 2 rounds remaining, and kept his scope on the aperture. The Type 96 did not fire again that day. At 1400 hours, George returned to the command post and reported to Colonel Fletcher. 2 soldiers in the crew confirmed down. 3 shots fired into the aperture. Gun appears non-functional for the present. Fletcher asked how many rounds George had expended. George said 7 shots total, 3 at the bunker, 4 on the approach for zeroing and practice. Fletcher said that was a very economical use of ammunition. He asked if George could do the same to position 12, which was the other machine gun position covering the northwestern approach. George asked about the distance and the aperture dimensions. Fletcher said 340 yards, and the aperture was wider, possibly 28 inches. George said give him until morning, and he would tell Fletcher whether the angle was workable. Position 12 was 340 yards from the nearest covered approach, and the angle was not ideal. George spent 2 hours the next morning studying it from the observation position and decided the geometry was marginal. The aperture was well positioned relative to the approach, and the bunker itself was partially masked by a large tree root that made a direct shot from the northwest impossible. He would need to approach from the north, which put him in ground that had no cover for the last 60 yards. He went back to Fletcher and explained the problem. Fletcher said he had a different idea. He asked George to come back at 1500 and meet someone. The someone was a Marine artillery captain named Delaney, who had been attached to the regiment for fire control purposes and who had been trying for 3 days to figure out how to direct artillery onto the Gifu positions through the canopy. Delaney was a compact man with a sun-burned face and the particular calm of someone who had been doing a dangerous job for a while and had learned not to invest emotionally in the danger. He had a map and a set of coordinates and a radio. He wanted to know if George could place his shots close enough to the aperture of position 12 to cause the crew to keep their heads down for 2 minutes while Delaney tried something with his 105mm howitzers. George asked what Delaney was going to try. Delaney said he had worked out a way to use the canopy deflection as a controlled variable rather than a problem, essentially adjusting the fuse delay on incoming rounds so they detonated approximately 3 feet above the bunker roof rather than deflecting off the canopy before reaching it. In theory, the overpressure from a 105mm detonation 3 feet above a log and earth roof would transmit enough force through the construction to disable the occupants even without direct penetration. In practice, he had not tested it because every time he tried to bring fire close enough, the crew of position 12 came up on the gun and kept everyone away from the observation positions he needed for accurate direction. George said he could keep the crew down for 2 minutes. He said he would need Hayes and an additional spotter, and he would need to be in the approach position before dawn. Delaney said that was workable. Fletcher said that was workable. George cleaned his Winchester that night and loaded 5 fresh rounds and checked the scope mounts and the eye relief and the trigger, the same ritual he went through before any engagement where he knew in advance what he would be doing. He thought about the geometry of position 12 and the 60 yards of exposed ground and the angle from the north. He had a solution that might work if everything went exactly right. Most things in combat did not go exactly right. George had learned this. He planned for it going wrong and still worked the problem. At 0530 on the 25th of December, George moved into the approach position for machine gun bunker, number 12 on the northwestern face of the Gifu. This was Christmas morning. Somewhere behind the lines, someone had arranged for turkey to be brought up to the regiment. George would miss the turkey. He had brought 4 pieces of hardtack and a canteen of water that still had a faint taste of the purification tablets from the river. He lay behind a fallen log on the north side of the approach and glassed the bunker through the Lyman Alaskan scope and waited for enough light to work. The bunker was 340 yards away. In the early light, it was a shape in vegetation, slightly darker than the surrounding undergrowth, because the fresh-cut timber of its construction had not yet weathered to match the jungle tones around it. The aperture was visible as a horizontal shadow at ground level. George watched it for 20 minutes without moving. At 0556, the gun fired a ranging burst to the southwest, confirming it was alert and operational. George noted the precise sound signature and the elevation of the muzzle flash for later reference. Hayes was to his right. The additional spotter, a corporal named Williams, who had been a deer hunter in Minnesota and who understood instinctively what he was being asked to do, was 6 feet to George's left with binoculars and a written set of instructions that George had given him the night before. The instructions covered what to watch for and what to report and in what order. Williams had read them 3 times and said he understood. George believed him. A man who grew up still, hunting deer in November in Minnesota, understood patience and observation in ways that range training could not replicate. At 0612, George began firing at position 12. He fired once into the aperture, on a line he had worked out the night before based on the angular relationship between his position to the north and the aperture orientation to the southwest. The bullet went through the opening. Williams confirmed it. The gun did not respond. George waited. At 0615, a second round, Williams confirmed it in the aperture. At 0617, Delaney's radio crackled, and George heard the captain giving adjusted coordinates to his gun line. There was a pause. Then the sound of 105mm rounds in the air, a distinctive note that anyone who has heard it recognizes, and the impacts came down on and around the Gifu complex, 340 yards away with a sound that shook the ground under George's position. 3 rounds in rapid succession. Then 2 more. Then silence. At 0618, the Type 96 at position 12 fired one final burst, a single ragged volley of approximately 8 rounds that went nowhere in particular, and stopped. It did not fire again. Williams said he could see smoke from the bunker area. Delaney's voice on the radio was steady and professional, calling adjustments, walking rounds, across the position. George stayed in the approach position for another hour, watching the aperture. No movement. No fire. At 073, he extracted to the command post and found Fletcher waiting with coffee that was mostly hot water with a memory of coffee in it, and Delaney sitting on an ammunition crate with a satisfied expression, and Morris standing to one side, looking at George the way a commanding officer looks at a subordinate who has done something unauthorized that happened to work. Fletcher said Delaney's fire had hit the bunker roof with 2 direct impacts, and the overpressure technique had functioned as calculated. The bunker was believed destroyed. With positions 8 and 12 both neutralized, the northwestern approach to the Gifu was now viable for a coordinated assault. He asked George if he had any observations about the remaining bunker positions on the north face. George said he had observations about 5 of them, and described what he had seen during his time in the approach positions over the preceding 3 days. Fletcher wrote the information down and passed it to the map table. The assault on the Gifu did not succeed on the 26th of December as originally planned. The Japanese resistance was stronger than the reduction of positions 8 and 12 had suggested, and the attacking companies ran into intact positions on the eastern face that had not been engaged. The battle for the Gifu would continue into January. The 132nd Infantry would eventually be replaced by the 35th Infantry in the direct assault role, having sustained casualties that reduced its effectiveness below the threshold required for sustained offensive operations. George spent the first week of January at a forward position, not assaulting the Gifu, but using his Winchester in the role that Morris had finally stopped arguing about, identifying and engaging Japanese soldiers who moved in the open between positions, disrupting the Japanese supply runs that moved at dusk along the ridge trails, and on 2 occasions engaging Japanese observers in trees who were directing mortar fire onto American positions. He worked alone or with Hayes, from prepared concealed positions that he moved between on no fixed schedule, using the same principles he had developed in the Point Cruz Groves. In late January, shoot and move. Never fire twice from the same position. Use the terrain for cover before and after each shot. Let the Japanese search for you in the wrong place. On the 7th of January, a Japanese sniper shot George in the left hand. The bullet went through the muscle between the thumb and forefinger without hitting bone, and George was able to keep hold of the Winchester through the impact, which he considered important. He moved immediately after being hit 40 yards to a new position, and spent 10 minutes looking for the sniper before his hand became too swollen to maintain the grip properly. He wrapped it with the field dressing from his kit and moved back to the company position. The medical officer said the wound was serious but not career. Ending, he told George to rest the hand for a week. George said he would try. The Gifu finally fell on the 23rd of January, 1943. The Japanese commander, Major Takeyoshi Inagaki, led the last 100 defenders in a banzai charge against American lines rather than surrender. Every man in that charge was killed. When the Americans entered the position and counted the bunkers and the dead and assessed what they had been assaulting for 5 weeks, the numbers were sobering. 47 bunkers, 500 defenders at the start of the battle, an unknown number of withdrawals during the fighting, the number who chose to die in place rather than leave. George was not present for the final assault. His hand had not healed as quickly as the medical officer had hoped, and he had been moved to the field hospital near Henderson Field on the 15th of January. The same progression of events that would happen again 3 weeks later when the Japanese shot him in the shoulder during operations on the Tanamboga River. He heard about the fall of the Gifu from a soldier in the next cot who had been there when Inagaki led his men out of the bunkers for the last time. Later, writing about the Gifu in the manuscript that would become Shots Fired in Anger, George described the Japanese defenders with a directness that surprised some readers. He had watched these soldiers hold a prepared position against an American force with artillery and air support and numerical superiority for 5 weeks. He had watched them fight from bunkers that were individually destroyed and replaced by new fighting holes dug overnight. He had watched them choose to die rather than withdraw. He had also watched them adapt to his Winchester, watching how they learned to cover approaches after the first time he disrupted a position, watching how they adjusted their observation and reaction times as they understood what was being done to them. He had, in some sense that he did not try to articulate directly in the manuscript, respected the technical quality of the opposition. The Winchester had accounted for 11 confirmed kills at the Gifu, over 16 days of intermittent engagement. 11 was a modest number against a position that eventually required 5 battalions and weeks of sustained assault to clear. George never represented it as anything more than what it was: one tool applied to one specific problem in a much larger fight, useful where the geometry was right and the patience was sufficient, limited where the geometry was wrong or the targets did not present. That was the honest assessment, and George made it. He kept the Winchester. By January 1943, Captain Morris had stopped suggesting that he should leave it with the supply sergeant. If this story moved you the way it moves us, do us a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about riflemen who prove themselves with skill and patience, real people, real decisions, real consequences. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.